this is the Splainer team. So we are the ones who are behind Splainer and who you have to put up with every day in your morning email box. Like I said, Sandeep, like we said when we introduced Sandeep when we were plugging the event, Sandeep is actually is a great person to have on an AMA because his writing and his expertise ranges across so many different things. He's written a fantastic debut novel, which is actually what I'm going to talk to him about to start with. So he can talk about publishing, he can talk about novels, he can talk about literature, but he's also written extensively on politics. And one of the great things about his writing is that he's very good at talking about that intersection of personality and politics, like whether it's Modi or it's Mamata, or even Rahul Gandhi. He has a lot of insights in how they operate in the political sphere, and also how we talk about politics or how certain issues get framed. Um, he's both actively involved in the queer community and written extensively about it. He has a lot of insights in terms of how things have evolved or changed, whether not just the law, but also the culture, the politics of the queer community. And he's also someone who spent 22 years and been a keen observer of the NRI. So he's also a very good person to talk to about, who the NRI is in the United States and, what is their worldview and mindset and whether we sort of reduce them to caricatures. We have lots of things to talk to about him. Please put your questions in the chat box, and then we'll just call on you, and you get to ask your own question. So you can frame it however way you want. We just ask that you put your question first into the chat box. So it's a conversation between you and Sandeep, as always. In our AMAs, we try and stay out of the way. So I'm just going to kick it off with the first question, Sandeep. So I want to talk about Don't Let Him Know, your novel. So this is your first debut novel, and you picked a very sort of what I would say a very complicated story to tell. The story basically is of an Indian couple where the father dies, and the son sort of then, after his death, discovers that his father is gay. And it shuttles between his father as a young man and his relationship with someone he clearly was very much in love with in Calcutta, and switches to San Francisco and the present, and focuses, I think, which is what makes it truly interesting, on the relationship between the husband and wife, which is not quite as simple, or where she was just used to be his beard. What are the definitions of love? What is the love between them? And her coming into her own actually after her husband's death. So I guess my question to you, Sandeep, is this is your first debut novel. It's very rare to have gay characters in a novel to begin with, and especially an Indian novel. And you pick this very complicated person, right? And who's not necessarily uh, the good guy. It's not necessarily about oppression, and it's not necessarily about clear cut, black and white kind of story. I wonder why you made those choices, and why you chose to tell a different kind of story about the gay experience. Wait.
Unmute. There we
Huh.
go. First of all, unmute. Uh, Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great fun to get Splainer every morning, and now to see the faces involved behind it is an extra treat, since I only really knew Lakshmi before this. In terms of the book, I think, well, first of all, I think what is something that's true of first novels in general is that you really have no expectation about who you're writing for, what you're writing for. You're just writing because you have a story to tell, so you don't even think whether it's too complicated or not complicated enough, or what boxes it ticks. You just write it, not even knowing whether it will ever see the light of day. So in that sense, it's hard to talk about why I chose certain themes, but there were some things that I was clear I wanted to do. And that was, I wanted to write a story that had characters who I felt were not just black or white, that they were shaded characters. And I wanted to make it a story that was about people that you could recognize perhaps, and not just think of in terms of victims. I think that especially when you're talking writing about any kind of minority, whether it is gay or any other minority, there is either the tendency to make them a victim, or to place them on some kind of pedestal, or you just tread very lightly around them. But in this book, I wanted to write the story where the person's sexuality is obviously a huge secret that will impact everything that happens to him, his family, and his future. But I also wanted to show that even if there are terrible secrets in a family, doesn't mean that every interaction with other family members is colored by that secret. By not disclosing his secret, by getting into this marriage with Romola, he obviously does her a great disservice. But that doesn't mean that when she chooses to stay in the marriage with him, even after she discovers his secret, that it must have been utter hell for her every single day. That even in this marriage that may be built on a lie, there still can be moments of tenderness and happiness, even though there is fundamentally a lie at the root of this marriage. And I wanted to talk about not just about her discovering that her husband has this secret, but really talk about what happens to the rest of her life. Does she become this utterly victimized figure so that I wanted to see whether now is her only identity going to be the wife of a man who is gay and did not disclose it before marriage, whether she has other things that also make up who she is. And that's sort of what I wanted to sort of try and explore. And in terms of the other complicated structure, I wrote this book as a bunch of short stories, really. They are all interconnected, but each chapter is like a short story that stands on its own. That was, to me, almost more complicated than the issues around identity or sexuality, or all of which I was dealing with, because those are things I sort of written about in some form or the other, or when I was in the US and volunteering with Tricon, which was the world's first South Asian LGBT group, and I used to edit their magazines. These were kinds of stories you would, very often get letters from people who were married men, and they would be writing letters trying to connect with people. And this was a time when you could also understand their point of view, where they felt like they had no other real options in life other than getting married, because they didn't feel like there was any other future for them as a gay person. And so those stories were sort of familiar to me, but I didn't want to just tell those stories. In fact, in some ways, as a writer, I was most interested in the character of the woman and what she made the mother of her life after she discovers this letter, this incriminating letter about her husband. And the other thing I wanted to do was about the son. Like, I think like most children, we tend to think that our parents were very boring, and that all the interesting things happen in our lives, and their lives obviously didn't really happen till they had us, and then after that they were just taken up with taking care of us. And I wanted to show in this thing that Amit, the son, is actually, to me, the more boring one. He is the sort of software engineer living in the Bay Area, dealing with and he has no idea in some ways how sort of interesting and complicated his parents' love story or love histories were. And, and in some ways, he would probably be mortified if he found out all the details that the reader finds out about their things, as most of us might well be about our own parents. I think it's much more fun to read about these things when it relates to other people's parents than our own. But yeah, so I'm not sure how much that answers your questions, but I think some of the complexities in the book were the complexity of themes, and some of it was about the complexity of the structure which I chose. And in some ways, as a writer, at the end, it was the complexity of the structure that made me lose even more of the hair I'd already been losing, because I had to keep track of who had died in chapter 3, and like, oh my god, the great grandmother can't reappear right now, or there was the grandmother in chapter 3 and now this whole thing is happening in this house, and where has the grandmother gone? She's vanished. I need to bring her back, and what color was the house then? So those were little things that I had to keep track of, that kept me that made me very nervous, because I was sure, persnickety as people are, that some reader would one day say, oh, I liked your book very much, but in the 3rd chapter you did said this, and then in the 6th chapter the room is colored green, but you had said the blue walls in that thing. So I was a little nervous this would happen.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that you did the closeting bit, because closeting is like the most it is the most fraught thing, right? The Indian man who gets married to, because it sort of intersects with feminism, where it's really a clear, to do that is a clear exertion of male privilege. But I also remember you talking to me about how these Indian men would come to Silicon Valley or the US, and they were married back home, and for them this was like, oh, freedom, we get to be gay here. And there's a lot of resentment from the Indian gay community towards these men, because they felt like, in somehow, like, they're being used in a different way.
Yeah, I remember going to a friend's party in the Bay Area. It's a South Asian gay, little social gay get together, and there was a guy who had come there. He had come on one of these work visas. He was a techie from Pune or Bombay or somewhere, and he'd come on this work visa, and he said he was sort of excited to go to gay bars and things in the Bay Area. But at the same time, he talked about, we were asking him about his life in India, and he said, oh, everything was great because he had a partner, a boyfriend in India, but he was also married. And he said, how does that work? He said, oh, it's fine, because now our wives are friends, so we get to socialize. We socialize together all the
Oh,
time,
wow.
because he's sort of my friend, so I get to spend lots of time with him and go away with him, and the wives are fine with him because the wives are also friends and socialize. Of course, the wives have no idea that their husbands have this whole other story going on. And I'm sure if the things were reversed, I don't know that he would be quite so sanguine about
Right.
his wife, if she was doing something like that, which is, I think, where you get to this whole issue of privilege becomes the amount of independence. Because we would often, when I would volunteer with Tricone, we would often get requests from gay men who were desperately looking for a lesbian for a marriage of convenience, where
Mm-hmm.
they would say that, you will get our parents off our backs, you lead your life, I'll lead my life, and that'll be fine. I don't know any of them that have actually worked, but I always remember thinking that, yeah, I think the amount of independence that when you say you lead your life and I lead my life, I don't know if it quite works that way, because I don't know if your in-laws will feel the same thing about your wife, spending her weekend going off on holidays with somebody else, or not coming home tonight, or whether the pressure to have grandchildren, how much that is going to be exerted on her, those kinds of things. It's not exactly as simple as you lead your life and I'll lead my life and we'll be fine. And interestingly, on that topic, I was just reading this interview with Nina Gupta. She has her new memoir that's just come out, and in one of them, she says that when she was pregnant with Masaba, there was she got some offers, to get married, just so to legitimize the whole thing, I get. And one of those offers came from a gay man who
Mm.
said, I can, we can get married, and then, I give you sort of the respectability, so you're not an unwed single mother. And then after that, I'll lead my life, you lead your life, and it'll be fine. And she turned it down because she said she had too much, she didn't want to go down that route.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's an interesting point that once you get married, anyway, the gendered rules kick in. Like what is expected of a
Absolutely.
wife is not, what is expected of a husband. So we have Nivedita, who seems to be a big, heard your podcast and really has a question about that. Nivedita, you want to ask your question? Nivedita.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
from Delhi. So I heard your podcast quite a few days back when the book released. So I just wanted to ask who was your favorite guest, who you really liked interviewing. Maybe not for the answers, maybe for your personal camaraderie, but who was your favorite?
Uh, Thanks for that, Nivedita, and thanks for listening to the podcast. This is always a very tricky question because you always feel like, oh my God, it's like it's like choosing a favorite guest can feel like you're passing judgment. But I mean, it's hard to think. Guests are fun for different reasons. Some of them are really good in terms of an interview. I remember when sometimes some people who've written books on politics. There was a recent book about the rise of actually L.K. Advani and Atal Bihari Vajpayee and the rise of the BJP, which I didn't necessarily think was going to be that fascinating, but the conversation was
I think
really
that was
fascinating.
Vinay Sitapati. I think that's
Vinay Sitapati, he as a guest, he
Oh,
was sort of wonderful, and
it's
he
too
could
irritating.
really explain things very well. But I have to say that in the podcast, I was probably the most starstruck when I did an interview with Sharmila Tagore. For it was for Satyajit Ray's 100th birth anniversary, and so I was quite starstruck with her and very nervous about doing the interview. And she was even more nervous about doing the interview because she couldn't quite figure out how this Zoom and all of this would work. But she was an absolute delight, and she talked for a long time. And then afterwards, she would say, I hope you edited it down, just like Satyajit Ray would edit, ruthlessly, because nobody wants to listen to a long, drawn out answer, which was, I think, wonderful because most people think they say such wonderful things that nothing should be edited out, whereas here she was like, please edit, please cut it down and make it shorter. And she was very warm and friendly and a diva, but at the same time, not at all arrogant or cutting people down to size or something like that. She was very frank and honest and happy to talk, so that was actually quite wonderful.
You've also interviewed so many people because Sandip also is sort of the go-to host for all the prominent, literary festivals. So you've actually interviewed a lot of authors. So do you have a favorite there amongst all the authors? I mean, and you've done a bunch of big names and you've done others. So do you have a favorite there?
Yeah, some people are, that's kind of an interesting thing. Like, I remember we once had this conversation where you said that sometimes you don't want to meet your favorite author because once you actually meet the person, they're no longer your favorite author
Exactly.
anymore.
You don't get too
Because
close to them, honestly.
yeah, so you learn, and that is, and I'm not going to take any names here, but it is that is absolutely true, because once you meet the authors, then you realize, oh, they can be as petty as you, and they might write wonderful prose, but when it comes to personal things, they're prickly and petty and looking out for slights, and it can be quite nerve-wracking to interview them. Sometimes, but some people genuinely enjoy that act of going on stage on a literary festival and talking to people, and that's a sort of a rare and wonderful thing. Like, for example, one of the people who's wonderful about it is someone like Devdutt Patnaik. He's like a, he has a certain um, connection with his audience, and if you get him going and he's in a good mood, he's just, you almost, as an interviewer, you don't have to do anything. Somebody like Atish Tasir is always fun to interview, because he is very forthright about his views and doesn't sort of mince words, and he's very. I recently, for the Jaipur Literature Festival, when they were doing these online things after the pandemic, I got a chance to do an interview with Rupert Everett, and and he was actually, and that was a good case of someone I didn't know before. He didn't know me, and I was worried because we were doing it in this kind of a Zoom format, so there was not, the chemistry is always a little tricky when you don't know people, as opposed to sitting on a stage together. But so I think it started off a little stiff, but as it got in, he really warmed up, and he had lots of funny stories to share, and he's a great raconteur, and that sort of made it really. So as an, I mean, I think it's when, as an interviewer, I sort of lose track of the fact that I'm the interviewer and getting nervous about, whether I'm covering all the questions. Then I know it's probably being a good interview in terms of the audience is getting into it as well.
And you don't have any anecdotes without names attached, or like someone who behaved really poorly?
No, it's not about someone. Yeah, sometimes people will. I try to save the even the mildly offensive questions for towards the end of the interview, in case they get pissed off at the beginning. But I mean, it's not like someone who behaved poorly, but sometimes I have interviewed people whose answers have been shorter than my questions, and so they say sort of yes, no, and it's not like they're being necessarily rude, but they're just taciturn people and kind of laconic. And that is terrifying for an interviewer, because you feel like you're going to literally run out of questions in the middle of it. And you're like, oh my God, we've only spent 15 minutes and I've pretty much run through all the questions I've had. And he's just been answering in these short bits. Among another person who's always a pleasure to interview is Pico Iyer, who is very articulate, and talks in wonderful. He gives wonderful stories and examples. And right now, during this pandemic, we've had to do several podcasts around the pandemic, and I think Dr. Gagandeep Kang is an amazing interviewer, because she can explain science in ways that a layperson can understand, and B, she talks in entire complete sentences. She does not have little ticks of saying yeah, like, which all of us do. It's the editor's delight. Every time we do the Jagandeep Kang interview, my editor, the podcast, says, well, I guess you don't need to transcribe. I can just get down to editing it right away. Because she's super articulate, and if you have to stop her and start her again, it's almost like she's reading from a script in front of her, but it's absolutely full sentences. You can edit it beautifully, and it's quite amazing.
Bhagda actually has a question for you. Bhagda, you want to ask that question?
Hi, Sandip. I wanted to know more about your work with the LGBTQ community in the US. I don't know the name of the NGO you worked for, but can you tell me a little more about that, and maybe some parallels or, comparisons you can draw with the community here in India?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Activism there versus activism here.
Yeah.
So the group in the US that I volunteered with was called Trikon, which means triangle. And it was started in 1986, before I'd gone to the US, by, of course, two Indian ex-IIT engineers in Silicon Valley who were in the Silicon Valley, but they would go to who basically got tired of having to bifurcate their lives between where they were Indian in a certain setting and gay in a different setting, and those worlds would never meet. And so they literally started this newsletter, and almost without knowing anybody to send it out to. So they started this newsletter, and they would just send it to every Indian South Asian publication they knew, and every gay lesbian publication they knew, hoping that somewhere there would be an overlap. And in fact, that's how I found out about it, because I read an article about it, which had been published in India, I think, by Society magazine. And I remember reading it and saying, huh? And it was this post box in the US. And and I think as an organization, it was like a sort of volunteer driven social organization. We used to bring out a magazine 4 times a year. But one of the wonderful things they did was that the magazine, which you had to subscribe to in the US, was available for free in India. So they would send it to anybody who wanted it in India. And initially, the personals column in that magazine was the way many Indians found other gay or lesbian Indians here, because that was the only sort of publication out there where they could openly look, try and find other people in their city and stuff like that. And one of the things that they did, this organization and the founders, a guy named Arvind Kumar, is that they also were the founders of an Indian magazine, an Indian cultural magazine in the Bay Area called India Currents, which dealt with cultural events happening in the Bay Area. So, for example, if a Bharatanatyam dancer from here goes and performs there, it would be in that cultural calendar. And so it was always very inspiring to me that these people were so embedded in the Indian community, and at the same time very out about their sexuality as well. So, for example, when in the Bay Area they started the India Day Parade, Trikon applied to march in that parade. And and I remember, and I had heard that the sort of the Federation of India Associations had a meeting where they wondered whether they could allow Trikon to march in that parade, whether it would corrupt the morals of the children around, whether this was sort of it was a bad image for the community. But other people on that meeting said, I can't say no, because it's Arvind and Ashok asking to march in their community. I can't be placing ads for my dance events or my dental practice or my realtor business in their magazine, and at the same time saying these same people are not allowed to march in the India Day Parade when they are so embedded in the community itself. So I think, and so Trikon marched every time in the India Day Parade, as well as the Pride Parade in San Francisco. And then that's sorry, the dog just came in. Hey, come here, come sit. Um, so once they did, so I learned that kind of activism which was not necessarily always confrontational, but which was very much about being part of the community, so that in the end the community has to accept you as who you are. And these people who were very sort of, I think, going to their house and having them cook dal chawal for us for the Trikon mailing parties, where we would sit and mail the letters, was actually, in its own sort of very homely way, hugely comforting for a lot of people who at that time had not yet come out to their own families. This was like having a family, to think that your gay life did not only have to happen inside a bar, that was the only place where you were allowed to be gay, that you could have gay in a domestic setting with cats and people watching Hindi movies and drinking chai and all of that. And at that time, of course, there was very little activism in India. That's start, but now that has happened in India, and it's quite amazing to see the kind of activism and the voices that are out there, and there's sort of the diversity of voices that are out there in India right now. Even before 377 was struck down, it felt like a very different country. And I think the biggest thing that activism has done in India is that they have educated the media. So right now, I think it's very hard, especially in English language media, to find a very sort of homophobic articles in the way there used to be at one time. I think the media has become a lot more. In fact, sometimes when I watched, pre 377 debates on channels like NDTV, it seemed like there was very little to debate about because everyone was sort of largely on the same side of the issue. And what has been really heartening to see is actually the number of parents who have been speaking out about the issue, and that when 377 was being challenged in court, that there was a whole petition that was written on behalf of some 18 parents who said that this law directly affected the happiness and well-being of their children was a long way from, say, early 2000s when the first petitions against 377 were filed in court, and it had to be filed by an NGO because that dealt with HIV/AIDS, because no gay person felt comfortable enough to stand in open court and say that a law like 377 personally affects me. By the time the law was read down, there were multiple people from IIT engineers to dancers to Ritu Dalmia, all willing to stand up and be counted. So that's quite remarkable.
What about racism though? Like, was there racism? I mean, when you know, you're South Asian gay in the United States, and there is racism against South Asians. Was race ever an issue within the larger gay community, the South Asian gay community belonging to the larger gay community?
I think race is always an issue in the US. I mean, it is, everything is so racially identified, and I think it's interesting because the race plays out in so many different ways. So there is obviously this larger issue where the gay community was, for a long time, the sort of public gay community was largely white. And so then you would, as a South Asian, you were automatically sort of marginalized or fetishized or exoticized, whatever. But then even as a fetish, it didn't work very well because you, as a small community, you will automatically put in clubbed geographically with the larger Asian community. But people who fetishized Asians were not interested in South Asians at all. They were only interested in East Asians. So in fact, I remember there was an Asian bar in San Francisco, and my roommate at that time said, "Oh, you're going to have no luck in an Asian bar. You should try out the Latino bar. That's sort of vaguely more skin color wise and looks wise might fit better in terms of people who are looking for, there was not much of a concept of curry queen at that time." But definitely race, I mean, so in that sense, but the race also worked the other way. I mean, I knew many South Asian, and I talk about gay men because that's the kind of people I knew more, who also fetishized and who could only possibly think that they could have a relationship with a white person. They could not imagine having a relationship with another South Asian or any other race other than white. Like the gayness always had to be in there, had become identified with whiteness, and they did not think that there was any other way to be gay and settled and happy in life other than to find
Why do
this.
you think that was? I mean, what is it about whiteness that sort of?
Because I think part of it is because they had always just associate gayness with whiteness, because
Oh,
the images of gay and white were always so much out there that they didn't think. And white was, I guess, regarded as aspirational in some ways, that you got yourself a white boyfriend, it meant something. And in fact, one of the first stories I wrote for a magazine called Gay Magazine, which is, I think, now defunct, called Christopher Street, was about a South Asian guy who finds himself attracted to an black man, and that story got transformed in a different way, and it's part of Don't Let Him Know, but it's no longer a gay story. It's actually it becomes a heterosexual thing. But in that story, it was based on some experiences and things I'd had there, where South Asians themselves were incredibly racist about black men. And I remember I had black gay friends at my college in Illinois, and I had South Asian friends who, not gay ones, but students who were most just very suspicious about, why are these black guys going into your apartment in a way they wouldn't have been if they had been white guys. It was that racism, there was both racism extended towards South Asians and racism radiating out from South Asians. I mean, it's a ladder. As a black friend of mine always said, South Asians come in and they figure out very quickly that the one group there above on that ladder are blacks. So people want to just climb up the ladder as opposed to, I mean, Mississippi Masala was really all about that anyway.
Right, right. And it's interesting when all of you are marginalized together to still have those divisions play out within that community.
Yeah, and in some ways, in a weird way, sometimes some of those divisions do reduce. So, for example, at the time when Tricone first started in the Bay Area, I think it was just sort of not necessarily because it tried extra hard to be, but just by sheer lack of numbers, it became more truly South Asian than most sort of South Asian groups because it was a place where gay Pakistanis or gay Nepali or gay Indian people, there weren't enough of us out there to form at that time to form their own separate groups. And so by default, we became part of that same group. So Tricone, as its board member, actually had people from Sri Lanka and Pakistan and all of these as board members of the group from its very, very early days. Now, of course, there's a lot more people out there, and you could probably have a gay Bengali group and a gay Telugu group, and the gay Bengali group could have fights within each other and split into two different gay Bengali groups like they do with all the Durga Pujas there anyway.
Sarah has a question for you. You're muted, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi.
So, I mean, taking in from your experience of living in the US as a gay man to coming back, how do you think the queer identity has evolved in India? And especially in terms of, like, you were talking about racism out there. I mean, even in India, there is a little bit of discomfort in terms of intersectionality of the community, in terms of, like, is trans people and Dalit people, like, in the community, like, is the queer identity still very privileged in India?
I think the short answer to that is yes. It is. And I think it's a privilege that comes from class, a privilege that comes, for a long time. There were many schisms in there. For example, certain kinds of schisms that probably I didn't notice in the US in some ways, where class was not such an enormous issue. In the US, you didn't, and obviously caste was not an issue. Race was an issue, but here, for example, from the very beginning, language was an enormous issue. People who were comfortable in English versus, people who were called the vernacular queens versus the English-speaking queen, and there was always a division between that. And then there was a division between people who were too campy and versus those who were more quote unquote sort of normative in their behavior. And for a long time, a lot of people and still resist this idea of intersectionality, where because they feel like, as a LGBT community, you should just strictly focus on issues that affect you for example, same-sex marriage or whatever, things like that, that will, as opposed to think about how it intersects with caste, or, why should, as a queer person, why should I have opinions on the Citizenship Amendment Act? This is not my issue. I should not be speaking up about that. And I think those conversations are happening right now. I think there are more and more queer Dalit voices that have been speaking up. But I think, like in every other sphere where Dalit voices are marginalized, that is true even here, because I don't think it's an accident that sort of the first generation of queer activists in India have all come from privilege, much more privilege and upper classes, because that also, once, it's only when you have that much privilege that you feel comfortable enough to push this frontier. Other people who did not have that privilege were probably very busy fighting other struggles for existence than talking about something like 377 or something like that. But I have still now, I do hear, from friends, stories about fairly ugly slurs that have been caste slurs that people routinely throw out there. And I don't think I think it sort of goes back to something we was saying about the complexity of a community. I think every community is representative of the larger community that's out there. There is no reason why the queer community should not be affected by sort of the same prejudices and biases that affect the larger community. So definitely a lot of it is out there, and we can hide it by saying, look, about looks, skin color, name it. All those issues are there. And people sometimes, and people will say, I mean, I think there was this, it came out as a joke. There was a couple of years ago, a gay activist had his mother place an ad in a try to place an ad in the Times of India, if you remember, where it says like Iyer seeks Iyer, Iyer man seeks Iyer groom, looking for a vegetarian Iyer groom. And I think he sort of did it tongue in cheek, but it also cut very close to people, where the people he was attacked by a lot of people for sort of promoting the same sort of casteist mentality, and he probably hadn't reckoned with it. He was sort of trying to channel his mother, and I think he was doing it for it. And it just made me laugh, because years before that, when two Indian friends of mine had gotten married in a civil ceremony in the Bay Area, I had to write an article about it. And at the end of it, I had sort of jokingly written that, that the Indians, don't understand coming out, but they do understand marriage. So I think in some ways, people, the idea of getting your son or daughter settled is something that Indians will catch on to sooner than the idea of coming out and personal liberty and all of those things. And I had jokingly said that a paper like India Abroad might see an ad where Brahmin boy seeks Brahmin boy from well-established family, with whatever 5-figure income and all of that. And then to see that in actuality, someone was doing an Iyer seeks Iyer ad in Times of India was kind of funny.
Yeah, so, but I remember, I was thinking about this. Do you remember we talked about parties in Kolkata, right? Gay parties, and kind of like that discomfort with these guys, or, whatever, queer people who'd come from the rural areas, right? And and yet the irony was that in some ways they were much more comfortable and upfront about being very sort of campy and gay and out there, and sort of even being walking the streets and being seen in public in that way, than supposedly the more liberated, educated upper class. And I was thinking about that a little bit, about like how Duti Chand has come out. She's the first openly gay athlete, and really comes from this very tiny, very
Right.
conservative village. So I want to see, like, do you think that is evolving too in terms of class? That now we're getting a new sort of kind of queer icon, who's not necessarily the English speaking, who's not the Vikram Seth, who's not the, and maybe they are better positioned in some ways, because if they are so much more willing to take that risk, and
Yeah, well, Vikram Seth just reminded me, and this goes back to Nivedita's question about favorite people. One of my favorite things was actually a session that I did at the Kolkata Literary Meet with Vikram Seth and his mother,
Mm.
Leela Seth. And it was one of the first sessions I did after when I moved to Kolkata. And where she was, she was, it was wonderful to see them together and how the sort of the sweetness between them, because Vikram can be a prickly person on stage sometimes, and sometimes he can be charming, sometimes he can be prickly. But with his mother, he was just like, he was just really, he obviously doted on her. And she talked so wonderfully and warmly about his sexuality and things. And one little story I'll share is she would say that so Vikram was this writer and he had moved back to India to write Suitable Boy, but at that time he was not a famous writer at all. And
Mm.
his brother Shantum was was doing Buddhist spiritual practice, and he would spend a lot of time meditating in the garden and chanting. And the daughter Aradhana was working in film, was just starting out to work in films, and so she would be gone all the time. And so one day, and Vikram's mother is of course a judge, and she said one day she overheard the driver saying, yeah, that he was really telling someone that he was really sorry for them because madam and sir, meaning Vikram, Leela Seth and her husband, they work so hard and they're such wonderful people and they have three children, and one of them just sits in his room and writes for God knows what all day. One is sitting in the garden in a little house and chanting and throwing little flower petals around, and the third one is his daughter, who is always on the he's always out, come back late at night, hanging out with men. And she was just like, I am so sorry for this such good people. What did they do to deserve children like that? And Leela said it made me laugh. And then when I was told, would you do something like that again, and she said, I would. I feel very lucky to have these children, and I would do it exactly this way all over again. And it was just very wonderful. But to get back to your question, it's true. I think it is kind of sometimes when I would go, to these parties, there would be these people who had come by local train to
Mm.
attend a gay party in a city, and they were stuck in the city until the local train started in the morning. So they would just be out partying all night or hang out at the station. They would bring these elaborate outfits that they wanted to wear for the party, very campy outfits that they would, many of them would have get them designed by their local tailor at the at wherever they whichever little town they lived in. And I think that has been the huge story of the last few years, where I think the coverage that we see of the LGBT movement has usually been the metropolitan coverage, the metropolis, these voices, people like mine. But these are the people who actually have a kind of confidence in themselves that we never did, because I think we were far more concerned about log kya kahenge, about minding our P's and Q's, about not embarrassing our parents or whatever, all these issues. And and in some ways this is a generation that is much more comfortable in their own skin. And you just have to now follow some of these people on Instagram to see how much fun they have, which I think many of us, I'm not saying that, everyone's lives is great and they don't have any issues and stuff like that, but there is an element of fun and enjoyment in their sexuality, which has often been missing in sort of the upper middle class story, which has been much more about angst and closet and coming out and, and all of these. And I think it's wonderful when these stories also get told, because there was this term in the community where people were called passport princesses, and this a passport princess was somebody who came from a privileged background but led a very straight-laced life here, but they could only live it up when they went to New York or San Francisco and London, and then they went to the the pride parade, and they would, this guy would wear his sari and his wig and his feather boa and live it up and everything, and then he would come back in India and he would become this very sort of beautiful son and all of that, these passport princesses. And in some ways this might be, but these people that I see are breaking down that stereotype where they are who they are, no matter where they are, whether they're in their small town or whether they're in their big city. And it is inspiring, even though I'm not going to romanticize it and say the class issue is not there. I think the class issue is very much always there. There is always a class divide, and people tend to gravitate towards people in their own class. But I when I go to a party and see all people take it all dressed up and taking the posing in front of the bathroom mirror and taking endless selfies, I sort of both roll my eyes at all that sort of selfiness and that sort of Korean fashion meets small town India. It's like kind of thing. But at the same time, I'm a little envious because I didn't have the courage to do that when I was their age.
Ragini has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
So just from listening to this conversation, because I think we're talking a lot about the real life experiences of the queer community. Over the past couple of years, we've also seen, especially with web series and stuff, a lot of queer representation in media, in Indian media especially. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think like, to what level is it an accurate representation? But then also, to what is that important? Is representation enough, or do we have to strive to sort of get it right?
And also whether there's a certain glamorization now that everyone is sort of, you're goy, you're wonderful. Like Made in Heaven had a whole gay plot line.
Right.
There's a certain kind of gay person who gets represented.
Yeah, I think Made in Heaven was landmark in the way that they actually had a strong gay plot line, but even before that became sort of a major plot line in the thing, they had a character who was openly gay from the get-go, but at the same time was more well-rounded than most gay representations, because his character was not just about being gay. He had his relationship with the woman who was his partner, and the ups and downs. And so, just as she was having ups and downs with her love life, he was having his own ups and downs. And I think that was sort of really a very different representation than we normally seen, where if there was a gay character, it became all about the character's sexuality. But you're right, in some sense, when I used to edit Tricone, we used to be looking out for books and magazines and things which had South Asian LGBT characters. And every time we found somebody like buried on page 205 of a book, we would say like, okay, we must include that in the magazine, because there were such few representations out there. And I remember there was this movie called Fresh Kill, where Sarita Chaudhary, who was in Mississippi Masala and then later in Homeland, she plays a lesbian, but she's not even South Asian in that movie. The character, it's directed by an Asian American. But because it was Sarita Chaudhary playing it, we did a whole interview with her for the magazine, because that was a good enough connection we had. In today's world, we would probably not include that at all in the South Asian LGBT experience, because there are lots more representations and books out there. Recently, I follow some Instagram handles that deal with LGBTQ literature and stuff, and there's so many books out there, even books that I've seen recently, but I didn't even know that they had gay content. So that's become very much part of it. Some of it is partly because it's become cool. So you have these gay characters pop up in television series and movies, the gay best friend has become kind of a cool trope to have right now. So I think to answer your question, Ragini, I think it's obvious you have to go beyond the representation, but I don't discount representation either. You have to have these representations, and the more representations you have, good, bad, and ugly, the better it is, because it means that the burden of representation doesn't have to fall on one character. I mean, I think when I wrote my book, I was terrified that the main gay character in it is obviously not a model gay character by any means, because he's a man who marries this woman, and it's not like he's particularly repents it or anything. So I was nervous how it would be taken, but I think by that time there were enough other characters out there. Even a film like, I think a lot of people have critiqued a film like Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan as being too sort of cleaned up, too clean cut, and things. And I don't think of it, in fact, as a gay love story at all, because this, unlike a normal Bollywood love story, a Bollywood love story would begin with these people meeting, they bang into each other, drop the piles of books that they're carrying, and he picks up her books, she picks up his books, or whatever, those tropes. In Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, they are already a couple when we meet them. So we never actually get to see their love story. The whole film is really about them coming out to the family. So it's actually about a coming out story to the family rather than a gay rom-com as it's described. But I think that was smart of them, because in a way, by making the family, the mother and the father and all these characters the butt of the joke, they could make it a comedy. Whereas if they had made the gay couple the butt of the jokes, they would probably go into very dicey areas of dealing with stereotypes, or being accused of peddling, pandering to stereotypes and all of that. But everyone is funny with, everyone could laugh at Nina Gupta's character and be amused by it. But if that's, but the two main gay characters, if you've seen the movie, are actually quite unfunny. They're very straight-laced and very inoffensive in all possible ways.
Actually, I want to ask a question that's. Oh, Chitra has a related question. Chitra, you want to ask it?
Sorry, I'm not well dressed, so I'm not showing my face. Hi, Sandip. Hi, Lakshmi.
Hi.
No, so just a related question is, do you feel that possibly that gap is because, Shubh Mangal Savdhan, do you feel that, or in the Made in Heaven, do you feel that the queer community is well represented if a cis person plays, the character? And don't you think, therefore, that there should be a added effort to recruit people from that community to well represent that community? Maybe they'll have a different perspective as well.
Yeah, this is very controversial.
It's a tricky thing, and I actually think it's more important to have representation in terms of the people who are writing the scripts, who are producing, and the people behind that, rather than the actor playing the part. Because I would like to think, as an actor, you would if you're a good actor, you would convincingly play whatever part that's put out to you. So I don't necessarily want to feel like someone's sexuality would determine the kind of roles they play, because I don't want anyone to turn this thing the other way around and say, oh, as a gay person, as a cis gay person, you can only play cis gay characters on screen, and like, what do you know about being heterosexual, even though you're living around in a heterosexual world? I think there are certain areas, like there was I think with certain communities it is trickier, but like if you were doing something, there was a soap opera that my mother was watching for a while, which was focused on the Hijra community here, and it was traditional soap opera. And I think there can be issues about representations in terms of, like, are you doing, how much outreach have you done to the Hijra community? Is this entirely being scripted and written by a cis community's vision of what a Hijra community looks like, and what, how Hijra household acts and behaves and all of that? I think those are the larger issues. But I think for me, when I say watched Made in Heaven, I didn't necessarily feel that the characters, they didn't make me cringe in the way very often gay characters on screen make you cringe because they are being played for laughs or whatever. But in Made in Heaven, I felt like the people behind, irrespective of what the sexuality of the actors were, that the people behind the script and who were writing it were people who were well versed enough in the community to try and put out a portrayal that people would be able to relate to and feel that it rang true. I mean, and I think that was also true of a film like Aligarh, where where I think Manoj Bajpayee did a wonderful job playing the character of Siras, and sort of both the angst and pathos. And I think a lot of gay people could probably relate to the loneliness of that character.
Actually,
Right, thank you.
mm,
I mean, I think by the way, Maiden in Heaven, she also said that she had intimacy consultants, Zoya Akhtar. So I mean, I think they also played a big role in that.
I'm sure.
That's
I
amazing.
think
That's
wonderful.
just some trivia. Yeah.
I wonder if I have a business card that says, yeah, I'm an intimacy consultant.
um, yeah, but is it more complicated for the trans? Because in Hollywood now it has become like a big thing.
Yeah.
Was it Scarlett Johansson who pulled out of a project? I forget who pulled out of a project because it became like, you're not trans. Why should you play trans?
Yeah, and you know that and this whole trans thing, as you know, is a very tricky issue, as all the recent hullabaloo, you know, whether J.K. Rowling and all of that that's happened, and I think it is a little different with the trans community. You know, I don't know whether, oh, if you're not trans, you can't play trans. I don't know whether I necessarily subscribe to that wholly. But then again, I'm speaking as a person who is not trans, so I don't, you know, I may miss out on seeing, you know, how what my representation is being. As a gay person, I would say I don't subscribe to the view that you have to be gay to play a gay character on screen. But I think as a I think a lot of the other issues that came up with the trans community is they feel like trans actors themselves get so few roles that it stings doubly hard when a role comes your way and someone else gets it for, you know, trying to acting trans. But then can Meryl Streep not play a trans character? You know, Meryl Streep can play anything if she puts some mind to it. So she probably can play a convincing character. And you know, I don't know, for example, yeah, I mean, these have become issues in ways that perhaps they were not at the time when Tilda Swinton was doing Orlando, and
Right.
all of that, you know, or you know, some of, or for that matter, I mean, that was a straight on camp thing where Quentin Crisp played Queen Elizabeth I in a movie, and that was a hilarious thing of an elderly queen playing another elderly queen on screen. I think that was almost done for the joke effect of it all.
So now I think we're almost getting to our hour. So I'm going to end actually with a political question, which is completely off topic, because you know we talk to you as only about gay and queer issues. So and no one knows Mamta better than you.
No,
So
I wouldn't say that.
probably
Lots of
you've
people
been
know Mamta much better
following
than
her
me.
for a very long time. And this seems to be her moment, man. I mean, everyone is talking about her as a national leader. The farmer movement leader, Tikait, went and met her. She has sent off her, sorry, I forget, I'm terrible with names. What's her political guru, man, her election guru. She sent him,
Prashant Kishore.
she sent him off to talk to Sharad Pawar. So, do you really see, and elections are coming, and so where do you see, like, what is the opportunity here? You think Mamta can actually pull this off?
Well, 24 is still a long time away. So I think a lot can happen. You know, Mamta's, this may be Mamta's moment right now here, but the BJP is a very formidable party, a huge party, and has definitely much more clout and nationally than she does. So I don't know whether she can pull it off, because also it is a fact that while this is her moment, the opposition in India is, everybody has their own ego, and the same issues that bedevil every coalition about who will become the face of the coalition will bedevil any attempt to put this together. Mamta right now has a bit of a David versus Goliath feel to her, and so but that's not going to last forever. But I think a lot of what her stature right now, her national stature, is thanks to the BJP. They gave it to her by pulling out all the big guns to go after it and making the election in Bengal such a prestige issue. I mean, now the BJP here is saying, look, we went from 3 seats to 70. Isn't that a marvelous thing? But the fact is, that is not the basis of comparison. Until this election day were going on, we were going to go from 3 seats to 200 seats or 180 seats. So they made this election. Mamta's was history. Mamta was going, and I saw lots of people on Twitter saying, oh yeah, when somebody like the home minister makes these predictions, he's rarely wrong. He always knows what he's talking about. So they kind of created this thing that this was a given. And that she defied the odds to come up against it has given her enormous stature here as a fighter. And I think it has not helped the BJP since the election, because everything they've done here has, whether it has smacked of being a sore loser in terms of, like the cases and the stuff with the chief secretary and all of that, whether it's right or wrong, legally sound or not, it felt like kids who say like, okay, we didn't win, so we're going to just break all the toys and let nobody play in our sandlot. So that hasn't sort of done them really any favors. But Mamta, she's unpredictable in the best and worst of ways. So you think it's you might think, oh, it's her moment. She's on the national stage, and because Mamta, she is such a loose cannon. Sometimes she can go and do something that completely blows everything up, even on her end. But I think the thing that many people had forgotten after, including me, after watching her in power for 10 years, is that she's never as good as when she's down. She is, she's her prestige here is as a street fighter. And we were talking in terms of the queer community, in terms of class and issues like that. Mamata Banerjee is a classic example of somebody whom sort of people from my bracket and all of that would look down on, because she wasn't of the right class, because her English grammar was off, because she could pronounce things funny and all of that. We could make fun of her English and all of these things. And so the really remarkable thing is that she overcame all these class issues to become the chief minister of the state and have a lot these people vote for her. And and so but she's done that because she is like, what was that Shakespeare quote, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I mean, she personifies that. You attack her, I mean, people forget now that during the CPM years, they put whatever 20, she had to have whatever 23 stitches in her head because she was beaten up, and she just bounced up for that and used those stitches to come to power. And I think people forgot that when they went up, when the BJP went after that, because in the end, I think nobody likes a bully. Even bullies don't like other bullies. And so when you appear to come across as a bully, it doesn't work very well. But now, now as the underdog, she has won. And now remains to be seen as to whether she can carry it forward. Because I remember when I did a story on her years ago, the quote I ended with was by this longtime political watcher. And he said, she's such a great leader, but does she know when to stop? And I think that's always been an issue.
But I had a question about the Modi versus. So you're right? So when the biggest guns, let's talk about Modi, right? Modi personally went and heckled her. So So it was a Modi versus Mamta. They made it a Modi versus Mamta fight, which is quite exceptional. It's the prime minister of the country versus the chief minister of one state. And he's personally heckling her. It's one thing for him to heckle Rahul Gandhi, who is, or a Sonia Gandhi, because they're like national leaders in a national election, right? So, but when he goes and says, everyone talked about the sexism of it, Didi or Didi, or, when he was hissing at her. But it's a real remarkable come down. But on the other hand, of all the people, maybe she is kind of, when you pair those two, I mean, yes, obviously opposition, unity, all of that. But if you take them as personalities, do you think she's like the one person who can actually go toe to toe with him? I mean, and she takes away his chaiwala thing as well, right? Because of her class, because of her, where she comes from. She takes away a lot of things that kind of he relies on for his charisma.
She does, and I think the other thing she can go toe to toe with him is because she is actually, she doesn't get cowed down. So you can't just sort of fix a steely gaze on her and sort of make her, subdue her. The more you try to do that, the more she comes back. I mean, she was, during this election, with whatever they were throwing at her, she was a spitfire all through the election. She was kicking footballs, and every day she would come up with a new, and some of it you have to understand Bengali just to because it just doesn't, a lot of what she says just doesn't translate. I mean, it makes no sense when you translate it, because she's almost talking in like sort of children's nursery rhymes to make a point. But she can go toe to toe with him, because I think in some ways she's also less preoccupied with coming across as a statesman. I think Modi is caught between wanting that public persona of the great statesman, but he also wants to heckle her with the Didi, oh Didi, and all of that. She doesn't care. She just wants to punch you. If she wants to punch you, she'll just go and she'll just come out breathing fire. She doesn't care. She'll talk in a torrent of Bengali. And I was watching a press conference where she was like, yes, no, I don't want to do. You national media, you ask the question, because you all translate my words and you twist them around, and I will talk to you. And she went off into a torrent of Bengali Hindi for the purpose of the national media, and then went into English. She just is sort of fearless in a way where you're not intimidated by many of the things that you feel like you should be intimidated by, because you feel like, oh, I don't know, I can't speak that fluently in English, or things like that. Those things don't faze her at all. So I think in some ways she is, in a personality wise, she does have the fire in her to go up against somebody like a Modi, where a Rahul Gandhi, in my opinion, does not, because
he doesn't care about playing nice either. Because anyone can play. I mean, her party plays as dirty as.
Yes, and she can play dirty, and she can out badmouth him if he wants to. She can make up names for him. She can call him all kinds of names. So she's, the names that they call the governor of the West Bengal right now. So in that sense, she can really get down and dirty in a way a Rahul Gandhi cannot. I think Rahul Gandhi is just too invested in being he's like the Bhadro Chele, the Bhadro Lok kind of person. He's tied to that personality, whereas she can switch from whatever incarnation you want from her any moment. So, but whether that translates on a national stage, I don't know. It's hard to, for us watching from Bengal, it's hard to see her in any capacity outside Bengal, because she feels like such an intrinsically Bengali figure. But it's almost like somebody from outside has to look at her and see her fitting into, because Trinamool has not done that well whenever it's tried to run for candidates outside Bengal. But Mamata has definitely never been as big in terms of national profile as she is right now. Even in the days when she was part of the ruling coalition and all of that, she was still a much more of a side leader. But now I think people realize you cannot take her for granted. That you cannot ride roughshod over her, at least.
I wanted to do it just because I would like to see Mamta campaign in UP. I think it'll be the most hilarious with her Hindi. And like, I don't think UP will even know what to make of her.
Well, well,
The
it'll
ball
be
smashed by Mamta.
it'll be fine, because sometimes I think some of the BJP leaders who came, I think people in a lot of, I'd heard from people who went to Yogi Adityanath's rallies, and they were like trying to apparently struggling to get people to the rallies because they really didn't know what to make of him, what he was talking about. I mean, Modi had a people went to see the Pradhan Mantri, but when Adityanath came, it's like, oh, this man is coming and talking, in his UP Hindi, and he's making these references that none of us are
Tamil
understanding.
Nadu also, which is
Yes,
crazy.
it's absolutely crazy. So, so it can be, yes, Mamta campaigning in UP would be, it would be a good reality show, almost, like you follow her around.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Sandeep,
Thank you.
for doing this. And, you know, great session. Talked about lots of things we actually mostly don't talk about in our AMAs. So I'm really, really happy. I'm really excited. So we'll anyway upload this onto YouTube so that many more people can watch this. So thank you and good night and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Good
Thanks
night.
again. Good night.